Are you ready for today's tutorial? Because we're going to be creating this particular animation and there's actually a lot to unpack. We're going to be going step by step and it's actually very simple, although the video might end up being a little longer than usual. With that, let's actually figure out how we can create this and learn a lot of tips and tricks along the way. In our default scene, we'll go ahead and bring our cursor to the junction of these two windows and click and drag to create a new window, after which we'll change this from the 3D viewport to the geometry node editor. Then we'll press this plus button to create a new geometry node tree, after which we'll zoom in, select the group input, and tap X to delete our default cube. Now we'll press Shift A and search for a curved circle so that we can create a bunch of points on which we'll instance the strands that will create the eye. So for now, we'll change the resolution to something really high. Let's go with 500, and maybe for the final render, I'll actually increase this resolution all the way to 1000 or even 1500. Next, on each of these 500 points that we just created, we need to instance some lines. So let's press Shift A and search for an instance on points node, plug that in right after the curved circle, and for the instance, let's search for a curved line. Now let's go ahead and change the direction of these curves because right now they're all pointed in the upward direction. So let's change this value to 0 on the Z and maybe a value of 1 on the Y. Now you see all of them are pointed in the Y direction. We actually want them to be pointed outward compared to the circle. And we can do that by aligning the rotation to their actual positions, because remember their position vector is equivalent to the normal vector. So let's search for a position node and then search for an align Euler to vector node. And because we want to align the Y direction, we're going to change this to Y and we're going to take the position and plug that into the vector. And then we can plug this rotation into the rotation. And now we'll have all of them pointed perfectly outward. Now I don't want this much of a gap to be present in the center. So I'm going to reduce this radius down to something like 0.3 and that should be good enough. Now I want each of these curves to have way more than just 2 points so that I can add in some amount of noise and get them to curve nicely to form that eyeball shape. So let's press Shift A and search for a resample curve node and then increase this count from 10 to maybe something like 100. Again, for the final render, I might make this 200 or something like that. In fact, for the tutorial, I'll just reduce it down to 50. Next, we actually need to set their position to form this sort of a curved shape, and that should go all the way around. So we can actually do that by many different methods. The method that I'm going to use is passing the actual position through a sine function. So let's press Shift A and search for a set position node. And again, to be able to change each of the 50 points that we just created individually, we have to make sure that these are no longer instances, but actual geometry. So let's press Shift A and search for a realize instances node and plug that in right here. Now for the set position, we want to offset it only on the Z axis. So let's press Shift A and search for a combine XYZ node so that we get access over just the Z location. Let's plug this in right here. And now let's press Shift A and search for a position node so that we can use the position of every single one of these points to drive the sine function. So let's actually take the length of the position by searching for a vector math node and simply changing this from add to length so that the further away it is, we just get a single value, which is going to be higher. Now let's go ahead and pass this through a sine function. So let's search for a math node and change it from add to sine. And now when we plug this in, we can use this to drive the Z value. Now you see we are getting this sine function, but the sine function is actually going like this and we want it to be much shorter. And for that, we're going to have to actually increase the frequency of the sine wave. So we can actually do that very easily by pressing Shift A and searching for another math node and adding that in before the actual sine function. We're not going to keep it at add, but we're going to keep it at multiply, which is going to help change the frequency. So now you can see we're actually being able to increase the frequency. Here we already have one entire wave. And if we do this, you see the entire distance is taking up only half a wave. So let's go ahead and increase it such that we have the entire top portion present right here. So we might have to multiply it by different values. We can change our viewport orientation to the front view by tapping 1 on the numpad. And then we can just bring it in so that both of these are approximately at the same level. Now that we have that set, I don't want it to actually be this pointy. I want it to be a much more gradual curve. And we can do that by changing the amplitude, and that's as simple as multiplying after the sine node. So let's go ahead and change this value to maybe 0.3. And now you see we get a much more rounded curve, which is exactly what I wanted. Now I think 0.3 might be too less. So let's go with 0.5. And that looks really good. However, there's one more issue, and that is the fact that it's been lifted up from the Z axis. And that's actually simple to fix. All we do is add in another math node and we keep it at add itself and we just subtract a certain value so that it comes back to the origin. So that you can just eyeball because it doesn't have to be perfect, and I think this looks good enough. Now that we have all of these set, we have to create some sort of randomness within the strands. So let's go ahead and move this set position here and add in another set position. So let's select this, press Shift D to duplicate it, and now start playing around with this offset. We want to displace it with some noise, so let's search for a noise texture, and now we'll press Shift A and search for a vector math node, because remember, noise textures are centered around 0.5, so if we directly connect this to the offset, it's going to shift towards the top right. To prevent that, we just plug in this vector math, change it to subtract, and we subtract a value of 0.5 on all of the axes. Now clearly this noise texture is way too strong, so let's start by reducing the scale to something like 3, and then reducing the overall effect by using another vector math node and setting it to scale and reducing the scale value from 1 to something like 0.3. So now we get this subtle noise that's present, and that looks really good. It'll look even better when we actually increase the number of strands present by increasing this resolution to something like 1500. So that's going to be really cool, but for now I'll keep it at 500 itself, just while I record the tutorial. Now that we have this curve created, we actually want this curve to come into existence, and we can do that in geometry nodes using a trim curve node. And you can see that by playing around with the end value of the trim curve, we can actually get it to come into existence just like that. But again, all of them are starting at the exact same time, and they're all ending at the exact same time as well, which doesn't look natural at all. So to create some randomness, we're going to search for a random value, and we're going to search for a math node so that we can add in some value to this random value to control the end socket. So let's plug this in right there. And essentially, if we add a value of -1, no matter the value that's gotten to the end from this random value, it will have a max value of 0. So we won't have a single curve present. Similarly, as we increase this all the way to a value of 1, no matter what the value is in this random value, the end value will have a minimum value of 1. So the entire curve for all of the curves will be present. So the animation is going to have a value of -1 all the way to a value of +1 for the final animation. So before we keyframe the values, let's set all of our animation defaults by going to our output properties, changing the resolution to 200% so that we get a 4K animation. Frame rate, I'm going to keep it at 60 frames per second. End frame, I'm going to keep at 600 so that it's a 10-second long animation. Output folder can be wherever you want to store it. File format, I'm going to choose FFmpeg video. The encoding, I'm going to change the container to MPEG-4 with an output quality of perceptually lossless. Now we're going to expand this timeline, press the back arrow to go to frame 0, and we'll just select this add node so that we can see the keyframes as they appear down here. If there are any other keyframes present, you can tap A and X to delete all keyframes. And then maybe on frame 1 itself, we can change this add value to -1 and then tap I to add in the keyframe. Finally, on frame 600, we can go ahead and change the value to a value of 1 and then tap I. And now when you play the animation, they should slowly come into existence, but it's going to play back really slowly. So I'm going to change this playback from play every frame to frame dropping so that I get a realistic idea of the speed at which it's actually going to come in and grow. Now you could have a linear growth just like that, but I actually want to emphasize on the growth, and I'm going to do that by changing this to the graph editor and then playing around with this particular curve that we have. In the graph editor, you can use Control middle mouse button to zoom in and out on the different axes. And if that doesn't work, you can always use these handlebars over here to zoom in and out. Now I'm going to switch this from bounding box center to individual centers so that I can just scale this up. And now you'll see it's going to start off much slower. It's going to speed up much more in the center, and it's going to end also much slower as well. But I don't want this ending one to be as slow as the start. So I'm just going to scale this down by a little bit, not completely to what it was before, but just a little bit. So something like that should be good. And I think I like this particular growth much better. Now the next issue is that we have the ends completely straight in a single line. I don't want that to happen. I want there to be some strands that are longer than the others. And we can do that by just randomizing the length of each of these curves, which we can do using this scale value on the instance on points where we instance the original lines. So let's go ahead and just shift these a bit and then press Shift A and search for a combine XYZ. Now the reason we're using a combine XYZ is because we want to change the length only on the Y axis. So we're going to keep the X and the Z values at 1, and we're going to change this Y value based on some random value. So let's search for another random value node. And we're just going to keep the min value at something like 0.8 and the max value can be 1.2. And of course, we can give it some random seed and then plug this into the Y, after which we can take the combined value and plug that into the scale. Now I think 0.8 and 1.2 is a bit too much. So let's change this to 0.9 and a max value of 1.1. And that looks good enough. Now that we have that randomized as well, we can start off creating some spheres that will be present at these tips as these curves grow. So to get that, we can press Shift A and search for a join geometry so that we have both the curves as well as the spheres on top of these curves. And to actually create the spheres, we'll press Shift A and search for an instance on points node. Now we want the trimmed curve to be present as the points, but we don't want to instance a sphere on every single one of the points. We want them only to be present on these tips. And we can select just these ends using an endpoint selection, which is a very handy node that allows us to select both the start as well as the end of any curve. So if we were to plug this into the selection, right now we have a start size at 1 and an end size of 1. So we'll see exactly where the spheres are instanced when we actually instance an icosphere. So let's search for the icosphere. We'll change this radius down to maybe 0.005. We'll increase the number of subdivisions to 2. And we'll set it to shade smooth. So let's search for a set shade smooth node and then plug the mesh into the geometry and this into the instance, and then simply take this instance and plug that into the join geometry. Now you can see we have spheres present at these tips, but we also have spheres present at the start as well. I don't want spheres to be present here. So what I do is I change this start size to 0. And that way we have none of them present over here and we have spheres present only at these outer edges, which is exactly what I want. However, there's one more issue. When we were to go back to frame 0, even though we don't have any of these curves, we have all the spheres present over here. And I don't really like the way that that looks. I want these spheres to appear only after the curves start growing. So in order to do that, we're actually going to compare this with the actual length of the curve. So let's press Shift A and search for a spline length node. And now we can compare if the length is greater than a certain value. So let's search for a compare node and then plug the length into socket A. And we want to check if it's greater than a value of maybe 0.1. Only then should it work. So we have to check both conditions have to be true, this as well as this. And to check if both are true, we can simply search for a Boolean math node and keep it set to and plug this result into the result. So now you can see only when these curves become this long, the spheres appear. I want them to appear from a bit shorter length. So let's just reduce this to maybe a value of 0.01. So now that looks great. If we play the animation, you can see that as the curves grow, the spheres actually appear. And I think that looks great. That's exactly what I wanted. So I'm going to keep it just like that for now. Now, the next thing that we have to do is actually give these curves some amount of thickness, because if we switch off overlays, they're not going to be rendered. So let's convert them to a mesh by searching for a curve to mesh node and plugging that in after the trim curve. For the profile curve, we're going to press Shift A and search for a curve circle. And because they're going to be very, very thin, we don't need any resolution on this. So we'll reduce that all the way to 3 so that it renders really fast. And we'll change the actual radius down to something very, very small. Let's go with 0.001 and we'll plug that into the profile curve. Now, if we switch off overlays, we have the curves as well as the spheres, which is exactly what I wanted. Now I do want these strands to have random colors. So I have to store some sort of random value for each of these curves, but I want the same random value to be used in these spheres as well. So let's go ahead and press Shift A and search for a capture attribute node over here so that we can capture a random value for each strand. So let's change this from point to spline and then press Shift A and search for a random value. Make sure that you give it a random seed and then go ahead and plug this value into the value. Now we need to actually store this random value for every single one of these meshes. So we can do that using a store named attribute node, plugging that in over here. For the name, we'll call it maybe random spline, so random S, and the value is going to be the attribute that we captured over here. Let's plug that in right here, and that should work absolutely fine. However, we want to store some attribute for each of these spheres as well. So we can do that by duplicating this store named attribute node, but this time we're going to change it from random S to random V for random value. I just realized that spheres and splines both start with S, so I shouldn't have named this as random S, but it's all right. This is random spline, this is random value, and we're going to take this value from here and plug that into the value over here. And of course, we want there to be a singular value for every single sphere. So we're going to change this from point to instance so that every instance gets one single color, which is based on this random value. Now that looks great. The last thing that we have to do is actually set the materials. So let's press Shift A, search for a set material node, plug that in right here and press Shift D to duplicate it and plug it in over here as well. Now let's go to the material properties and add in a new material slot by pressing this plus button, and then we'll press this plus button to create a new material. We'll name the first material as maybe spheres. Maybe the second material we can name as splines. And then we'll simply choose spheres over here and we'll choose splines from this set material down here. Now to actually play with the materials, we'll go ahead and change our viewport shading to rendered so that we can see the changes that we make. And we'll go to our render properties. We'll switch on bloom and screen space reflections. But under the bloom, we'll change the intensity down to 0.02. And we'll clamp it down at maybe a value of 5. Under the screen space reflections, we'll also expand it and switch on refraction because we will be creating a glass dome on top of this and we want there to be actual refractions occurring. In the next version of Eevee, we won't be having to do any of these. So in Blender version 4.1, we'll be able to switch on ray tracing for Eevee as well. And I can't wait to actually experiment with that as well. For now, to actually play around with the materials, we'll have to switch this over to the shader editor and then we'll press period on our numpad to centralize the nodes. And for the splines, let's go ahead and delete the principled BSDF and press Shift A and search for a diffuse BSDF. Now let's plug this into the surface. We'll keep the roughness at 0 and we'll press Shift A and search for an attribute node. Now remember, we had stored an attribute called rand_s for every single one of these spheres. So we'll take this, plug the color into the color, and now we should have a variation of black lines as well as white lines and everything in between. However, we need to change these colors to not just be black or white, but the colors that we want. And to do that, we search for a color ramp node and we plug that in right here. And we can now choose whatever colors we want. So maybe I want it to be a bluish eye with orange stripes. So I'll change this to a bluish color like that. This color I can change to an orangish color, and I can change this from linear to constant so that we have either blue or orange. And I'll just bring this in, and maybe I want one more stop, which I'm going to change to white so that I have a few white stripes as well. So I'll just reduce this saturation down to 0. Now I have white stripes, blue stripes, as well as orange stripes. And I'm going to have to copy this exact color ramp for my spheres as well. So it's a smart idea to actually change these colors appropriately. So I'll keep this position at maybe 0.2. This one, I can change the position to maybe 0.7 so that I can just use these same values when creating the color ramp for the spheres as well. Now let's go ahead and switch over to our spheres material by going to our material properties and switching on spheres from here. We'll delete the principled PSDF and we'll search for an emission node. Now let's go ahead and plug this emission into the surface and we'll change the strength to something really high. Let's go with the value of 100. Now for the color, we're going to have to use the exact same thing that we did. So let's search for an attribute node. But this time we're going to have to change this from geometry to instancer because remember these spheres are only instances and the name is going to be random value. So rand v, and then press Shift A and search for a color ramp node and plug this color into the factor. Remember we had 3 stops. So the first stop was at 0 with a value of 1, which is just white. The second stop has to be at a position of 0.2 and the color is going to be this bluish color. The last one was at a position of 0.7 and it was an orangish color. So let's give it that same orangish color and change this from linear to constant and then plug this into the color. Now, if you actually look at it, every white spline has a white color dot, the orange splines have an orange dot, and the blue splines have a blue dot, which is exactly what I wanted, and that's perfectly all right. Now we need this to be way brighter. So let's take the light, press Alt G to clear its location, and then we'll increase the power from 1000 to maybe 5000, and we'll just press GZ to just lift it up by quite a bit. Now that looks great. Let's press Shift D followed by Shift Z, and then we'll just bring it closer to this edge so that even this area is lit up even more. We can switch on overlays so that we can see it better and just bring it very close to that position. Now I think that looks good enough, and we can go to our world properties and change the background all the way to black. If that's all you want for your eye, you can stop right here. But now we're going to go ahead and create a glass lining on top of it. Now the glass lining will look much better in Eevee next, where we have ray tracing, and it'll also look great in cycles. However, we're going to manage with Eevee itself today, and we're going to learn settings to make it look much better. So let's go back into our geometry node editor and then start playing around with another branch to be added into the join geometry right at the end. So the way we're going to do this is switch back to a viewport shading of solid. We'll switch on X-ray so that we can see underneath the glass dome as well. And let's create the dome. Let's press Shift A and search for an icosphere. Then let's increase the number of subdivisions to something really high. Let's go with 6 for the tutorial. I might make it 7 or 8 while actually rendering. Then let's plug this into the join geometry for now. Now let's go ahead and increase this radius to a very high amount. Let's go with a radius of maybe 7 units. And then we have to go ahead and bring this down so that only the tip is present right here. So to bring this down, we'll press Shift A and search for a set position node, and then we'll just bring this Z value down until it's just above the eye. So something like that looks great. And we have this dome shape right here. Now I think a radius of 7 was a bit too much. Let's change the radius to 6 and then lift it up on the Z. And I think this curvature is absolutely perfect. We can press 1 to go into our front view, and you can see how we have the curvature right above the eye. If you want lesser curvature, you have to increase the radius. If you want more curvature, you have to decrease the radius. For now, I think this is absolutely perfect. Let's go ahead and delete any point that's present underneath the eye. So that's simple. All we have to do is search for a delete geometry node and then delete it based on the position if the position is less than 0 on the Z. So let's search for a position node, and we want only the Z value. So let's search for a separate XYZ node and then plug the position into the vector. Now we have to compare if the Z is less than 0. So let's search for a compare node, check for less than, and take this Z, plug it into socket A, plug the result into the selection, and that's exactly what we want. Maybe I want it to be a little longer just for safety precautions. So let's just reduce this a bit more till everything is covered, and I think that looks great. Now let's go ahead and set material for this as well. So let's duplicate this set material, press Shift D to duplicate it, plug it in right here, and then go to the material properties, add in a new material slot by pressing this button. Press this button to create a new material, and we'll change this to glass dome. Now let's go ahead and select that on this set material, after which we can play around with the material for the glass dome. So let's switch this to the shader editor. And with glass dome selected, we'll press period on our numpad to centralize the nodes, and let's delete the principal to BSDF. Now let's go to our material settings, change the blend mode from opaque to alpha blend. Shadow mode, we're going to choose none, and we're going to switch off show backface, and we're going to switch on screen space refractions. Now let's press Shift A and search for a glass BSDF and plug that into the surface. And to actually see the glass, we're going to have to switch our viewport shading back to rendered. Now this obviously doesn't look too good. So the way we're going to fix this is by reducing this IOR from 1.45 to 1.1, which decreases the amount of refraction that's actually happening. Remember, if you were to keep the IOR at exactly 1, the glass will become completely invisible as light passes right through it. So I'm going to keep it at a small value of 1.1 itself so that we have that refraction. Then all the way down to the refraction depth, we're going to change this to maybe a value of 0.2 so that we have slightly lesser refraction occurring. So if you see, this is a value of 0 and it just lifts up as well, while this is a value of 0.2 where we actually retain that dome shape while having some amount of refraction. Now again, this is up to your requirements, but I'll leave it like this for now. There are a few more changes that I'd like to make in the geometry node section itself. One being the fact that we have this dome, but we forgot to shade it smooth, so you can actually see each individual face over here. And the second thing is that I think it's a bit too high compared to the actual object. If we go to 1 and switch on transparency, you can see there's quite a bit of gap over here. So let's reduce that by going back to our geometry node editor, then going down to the set position and just decreasing this even more. We'll reduce the radius to 5 so that we get some more curvature, and we'll bring it exactly there. Then we'll go ahead and press Shift A and search for a set shade smooth node and plug that in right after the delete geometry. And now we can start playing around with the material once again in the shader editor. With our viewport set to rendered, let's go ahead and press period on our numpad to centralize the nodes, press Shift A and search for a mix shader. And we're going to actually mix in some amount of transparency. So let's search for a transparent BSDF and plug that into the second socket of the mix shader. And now since we want this dome to actually grow from the center outward, what we're going to do is we're going to control this factor using a gradient texture, and we're essentially going to move the gradient down as the animation progresses. So let's press Ctrl T with the node wrangler enabled to get the texture coordinate and mapping nodes. Let's switch it from generated to object, and let's plug this color through a color ramp node so that we get some more control. And we'll also switch it from linear to constant so that either the glass is there or it's not there, and we don't get a nice fall off of the glass appearing. Now you could keep it with a nice fall off, but I don't want that in my animation, so I'm going to keep it like this. Let's take this color and plug it into the factor, and now you can see we have some transparency here and the glass on this side. So clearly this isn't the gradient that we want. Let's go ahead and change the direction of the gradient. And to actually preview this, we can just Ctrl Shift click the color ramp to see exactly what the gradient looks like. And that's not what we wanted. So let's rotate it on the y-axis by 90 degrees. And now by playing around with the x-axis location, we should be able to get the gradient to slowly appear just like that. So that's the animation that we want. And we want to start it from a value where it's absolutely nothing over here. And then as we increase this, we slowly get it to transition into the glass. But because we're going from black to white, we actually need the transparent BSDF to be on the top shader and the glass to be at the bottom. Or we can just flip the color ramp by changing this color from a black to a color of white and this one to a color of black. So now we're gonna have it switch from a complete transparent shader to the glass shader as we animate this. So let's go ahead and actually animate it. Let's start at a value of 0.1 on frame 1. So let's hover over this and tap I, and then we'll go to frame 600, or maybe just a little before that. Let's go to frame 570, which is half a second before the end. And then let's just bring this X location in all the way to about there. And then let's hover over it and tap I. Now let's select this particular node, press T and choose linear so that it comes in a very linear fashion. Now let's go ahead and plug this mix shader into the material output, and we can actually see the glass slowly come in as well. And in fact, I don't actually want it to start right at the beginning. I want the glass to start appearing only halfway through the animation. So let's select this and press G and move it all the way to frame 300. So now we'll have the actual lines coming in, and we'll have this curve or the glass grow around it later on. So if you actually take a look at it, till frame 300, we'll have just the curves growing. But after frame 300, we'll also have this glass dome on top growing and curving around it, which is the exact effect that I was going for. Now that I have that set, we can set up our camera. So let's go ahead and select our camera, press 0 to go into your camera view. We'll switch on overlays just to help us for the time being. I'll press GZ twice to move it on the local Z axis, which will help me zoom in. Then I'll press R followed by Z twice to rotate it to a nice angle that I feel suits this particular scene. Then I'll just press G twice to place it. And I think that should be good enough. I might play around with this a bit later on, but for now, that's the idea. Along with that, each of these lights have a very sharp line. I want to actually increase that radius. So I'm just going to increase this radius a bit over here. And that's good enough for this light. This light, I don't want it to be seen over here. So I'll just press G twice and I'll just move it so that it comes outside that region, but I'll keep it in a position that it actually lights up the lines as well. Now this might look great, but there's still one more thing that we can do to enhance this and bring it over to the absolute next level. And that's using some compositing. So let's go ahead and switch this window from the shader editor to the compositor. And to actually see the compositing effects, we're going to expand this dropdown and choose compositor as camera so that whenever we're in the camera view, we see the complete composited effect. Let's switch on use nodes. And for this render layer, we'll just bring it to the side and press Shift A and search for a glare node. Now let's plug that in right here. And I'm going to change it from streaks to ghost. And I think that looks really cool. However, the effect is way too strong. So to reduce the effect, we're going to search for a mix node and we're going to plug it in after the glare. And we're just going to mix in the original image with the glared image. And we're going to reduce this factor to maybe 0.9. And I think that should be good enough to add in a nice amount of glare, which makes this animation look amazing. And that's actually all there is to creating this particular animation. There might be another camera angle that I will be shooting, which will be from this top view. And when I shoot it from the top view, I don't want the light to be present exactly here. So I'm going to select the light and press G to just bring it over to the side. And I think that looks great. And another last minute touch that I feel is necessary is the fact that we don't need this glass to become complete glass. We can actually keep some amount of transparency. To do that, we'll go to our shader editor. And for this color on the color ramp, instead of keeping it as a complete black, which means we'll completely go to the glass shader, we can actually select it and give it a small value, maybe a value of 0.2, so that it's never completely glass and it's actually a bit transparent as well. So that might be what you're looking for. Again, it's really up to you to play around with this and choose what suits your scene the best. There's also some render properties that we can change, such as the actual color management, where we can switch this look from none to high contrast to give it a slightly different look as well. But once you're happy with everything, you can go ahead and press render animation. I know this was a slightly longer one, but if you watched so far, thank you so much. I really do appreciate it. I post multiple videos like this. We have sci-fi animations, loops, abstract loops, as well as different tutorials for shaders, procedural materials, and also explanations of how different nodes work, such as the vector math node, light path node, noise textures, and so on and so forth. If you think that type of content is stuff that you'd like to watch, definitely check them out, because I post videos every single day and there's something or the other that will benefit you if you go through the channels and watch videos that might intrigue you. Until my next video comes out tomorrow, thank you so much for watching, keep creating, and don't forget to stay creative.